Welcome to Ulterior Moto, your home for writers' reviews and how-tos. Today, we are changing the oil and springs on the forks. So this is a 2005 GSX-R 600 fork. Everything about it is stock presently. It's got 7-weight oil in it that's been through about a dozen track days, so its life is expired anyway. And it's got some 0.85 springs in it. And at this point in my development, those springs aren't enough. The weight of the oil isn't enough as well. And I've got all the preload in it, all the compression, and I'm still coming close to bottoming out. And I don't want to get all the way there because that's when the bad things happen. So we're going to go step by step on how to do this. If you want to see a video with the fancy vices and all the great tools, you check out Dave Moss. And this is where I learned what I know about this, but I don't have those. I've got a pretty basic vise, a few specialty tools, but really the cheaper ones. And it makes it a little more of a struggle, quite honestly, but we can get it done. We can get it done in our own garage, or just behind the garage in this case. All right, let's get started. So the first thing we'll need to do here is we're going to need to take all the preload out before you open it up. As you saw, the preload is maxed out. Before I get too far along in the process, I do want to tell you that if you're just doing the oil, write down your settings before you do. That way you have a good baseline. They're not really relevant to me because I'm changing so much internally. I'm gonna have to start from scratch, basically. So keep that in mind. Anyway, the next thing we'll need to do is remove the fork cap. For this, it's a 32 millimeter. And for the preload, it was 22. So now I've done this before. I've serviced these before. They're, as you can tell, it didn't take a whole lot of effort. If this had never been touched, it probably would take a heck of a lot of effort. All right, let's twist off the fork cap. I like to use the socket to give me a little more leverage. All right, you hear that? Maybe you didn't, but there's a little bit of a thump there. There. That lets you know that you've completed the threads. It's kind of jumping back down. All right, on to the next step. If you want to double check that your cap is indeed all the way off of its threads, you can just lift up the foot. That'll confirm it. All right. Now at this point, we're going to drain the fluid. It's not going to all come out, but it'll make it easier to manage later. If you have one of the fancy tools that will allow you to hold the foot of the fork and use some tools to compress it, that's cool. I'm not at that stage personally, so I have the cheaper tools. So I've put the fork back in the vise just for this step, just to make it a little less unwieldy. So what I'm going to do here, it's got the compressor tool adjusted wide enough so it'll go over the outside of the fork. Lift up the fork cap, and at this point what we want to do is get those points inside the holes. And you want to get as balanced as possible. So now that we're close, get that one in there. And this one in there. Right, firmly seated because you don't want those coming out at all. All right, so now that's set up. Let's go inside for the next step. For this next step, the point of this tool really is to slide down the spacer. Now, the spring is under the spacer, so that's helping to shove it up. So we need to expose the adjustment rod and the nuts that are inside this. And what we're going to do is slide that down, shove this in, and this will slide in between the spacer and the adjustment rod nuts. And for that, we need 3 hands. So I'll have a special guest here to help me in a moment. Now that we've got the spring compressed and we have access to this nut on the rod and then this piece above it which has a couple of flats, we need to separate these two by working this nut down. Now there is one issue with that for your typical tool, and that is my wrench is too thick to fit on that bottom nut. So fortunately, in the toolkit of my SV is where I found this thing. This is a very thin 17 millimeter wrench. To give you an idea, that's 0.217 inches. And the Craftsman here, 325. So you need something pretty close to that 217 number there. All right. So we want to twist these so that they're coming apart. Yeah, so not super easy. Our next step, and we will need a helper with this again, is to remove this tool from the top, sink the rebound rod down in there, and then relieve pressure from the spring. And then we can start disassembling more. All right, go ahead and push it down as far as you can.
That's as far as I can get it.
Okay, great, thank you. Now I can remove the tool from the spacer here. This will allow me to use it again later on the next fork while we're letting this one drain. So I'm going to slide it onto the adjuster there. There's multiple pieces. There's also a washer in there. And we can pull out the fork spring. Now I'm about to change this, but it's a good place to keep it, right? Next, we'll drain the rest of the fluid out of this tube. There's going to be a lot of debris in there because basically this spring is sliding against the inside of the fork tube, and that's steel on steel, just makes little tiny particulates that pollute the fluid. So let's pour it out. I'm going to set this in here for a bit, let that drain out as much as possible. This is a good time to get started on the other fork while you're waiting for this to drain out. This should drain for at least 15 minutes, as much as half an hour. Here I'm trying to capture just what ends up in your fork oil and all these little bits of metal. As you can see, I've got my bucket kind of tilted here, but you can see where it's drained down, and all these little discolorations here, that's all just fine little bits of steel from your spring. Just rub up against the inside of the cartridge over and over and over. And this is after a dozen or so track days, and that's about the time you need to be swapping your fluid if that's what you're doing. So you can see these little sort of rivers of metal particles in there. At this point, we can separate the outer tube from the inner tube and start working on the outer. Set that gently in there. We'll flip this over. First, we're going to take off the dust cap. Slide our screwdriver in there. Kind of work it in slowly. It's pretty dirty, and it's on there pretty good. All right, now we got it in there. And just start turning and working your way around. And this is pretty gross. For a dozen or so track days, it's pretty dirty and disgusting. So we'll set that aside for now, and then we're going to address the inner seal. As you can see in there, we have the seal. It's held in by that ring. So we're going to get in there and clean that up pretty good. You want to use a paper towel for this, not like a cotton cloth, because you don't want to get the, let's see how gross that is. You don't want to get like lint inside there or anything like that that can contaminate things and reduce the sealing properties. And get that top ledge of it as well as best I can. It was pretty dirty, but if you got a road bike and you're doing this, it may be a lot worse. Like I said, it's only maybe a dozen track days, so figure less than 3 hours for each of those. It's really only 36 hours of use. Heavy use, but only 36. All right, so next we're going to use some of the red grease here. Set this down to help lubricate things when we put it back together. You may have noticed I put on gloves, and this is the reason for that. I think you could use a paintbrush or something like that too if you got a little one. I like to just use my fingers with a glove on and then chuck the gloves, of course, when you're done. I'm going to make sure that I kept that on the seal more than on the fork tube itself. Okay, that's good. Next we'll move on to addressing the dust cover. Put this back in there to keep draining. Go ahead and use a new towel. Inside, not too bad. So that is kind of gross. Outside, I'm sure it's going to be much worse. Not just the dirt, but all the brake dust as well. I want to give a lot of credit to Dave Moss for just, sharing information. I wouldn't know how to do any of this. Wouldn't have the confidence to approach it on my own if it wasn't for Dave. And at the moment his health isn't so great. So if you want to really dive deep into this kind of stuff, by all means, check out Dave Moss Tuning, and consider subscribing to his site, because he's got a lot of content just for members, and it's super helpful if you really want to know as much as you can about suspension, because it does seem like a dark art at times. Check him out for sure. It's well worth it, and we're just so lucky where I live to be able to have someone like Dave coach us through everything. It's absolutely amazing. If you have a Trek suspension guy on hand, definitely take them up on it. Even if you're not racing or whatever, or you just doing a track day, kind of let them know, hey, I do street riding, I do track days, and he can help you set up your suspension for either one. And also work with you during the day, because as the track conditions change and hopefully you get faster, your settings are going to change, your tire pressures are going to change, and he can really coach you through how to do that on your own. And clean up the chrome tube, inspect that. You can polish these up if you need to, and just get some very fine, very, very fine sandpaper like emery cloth, and put it in a vise and just start kind of sanding away over and over and over until you get rid of them. But I think this will be good. Next thing is to put that dust cover back. We'll put it on the chrome tube, slide that down. Then we're going to take our outer tube and put that on. This is tapered a little bit at the top, but you do want to get it line them up as much as possible. There we go. I'm going to seat this outer tube around the dust cover. There we go. Our next step is to fill our fork tube with fork oil. So I'm going up from a 7-weight Bel-Ray to a 10-weight, and a note about that, the weight isn't really all that specific. It's not a really good unit of measurement, actually. If you really want to dig into it, look at the centistokes, which is a better indication of the viscosity of an oil. So you could find that 7-weight in one brand could equal a 10-weight in another. So when I look at the chart, and I'll link to that chart in my article at ulteriormoto.com. The Bel-Ray 10-weight is really in the window that most fork oils are. I've seen it vary from generally around 32 to 35 centistokes. The Bel-Ray is at 33. But there are some brands I've seen as low as 20 and as high as 48. So if you're just in the need to move up a weight and you already know what you got in your fork, that's a good way to judge it. If not, if you don't know what oil is in that fork already, you're going to have to kind of try and guess. It's probably whatever the manufacturer said it would be, plus it's probably worn out. So whatever you're choosing, if you're in the ballpark, it's going to be an upgrade to what you got. But remember that for next time you go to change your oil, so you know what you're changing to and what you're changing from, if that's necessary. All right, so let's crack this open. And I will be filling to just above this line right here. I kind of have to eyeball that, but there it goes. All right, it doesn't really need to be that precise just yet. What we're going to be doing now is making sure that there's plenty of oil in the rod. So we're going to use our tool specifically for this. You see you can thread at either end, and there's some holes through it. Thread that on there, and then we're gonna, just enough till you can grab it, basically. You don't need to make it tight. But what we're doing is introducing some fluid in there. And if you can hear that little gurgling, just do this nicely and slow. Otherwise you're gonna end up splashing yourself. And sink it down to the bottom there. And what we're doing is we're getting that air bubble out. So you can see fluid start coming out this hole. That's a good indication that we're making progress. And this will take probably a dozen cycles, possibly even more, before it starts purging fully. I can still hear the air at the top of the stroke. Tells me I got more to do. Now what you want to have happen is oil coming out of that at the top and bottom of the stroke. Oh, we're almost there, almost there. Is that about 6? There we go. Now on to the next tool. Now if you do have a vise that has a pan at the bottom, that's awesome. But that's the reason I'm not doing it this way, that way at the moment. It's because I don't. So keeping this upright as much as possible. Let's see, we're drawing air. So we need more fork oil. I'm going to take another look just to eyeball it, see how far off I am. Ah, very close. Very close, actually. I believe I'm just entering the fluid there. Let's use our tool to find out. Yep. Okay, I keep drawing until I just get air. And that's it. Perfectly set. Now it is time to reassemble this. I've got my old spring here, my new spring. I have made sure to size them up, and they are identical in length, so I know I don't have to make any other adjustments like to my spacer or whatnot. So I can drop that in there gently so I don't splash myself, or not splash myself too much anyway. And the damping rod, make sure that I've got everything in the order it's supposed to be. So there's actually 2 pieces of plastic there. There's the spacer, the little washer up there at the top. Now what I've done here is I've adjusted this all the way in. Now for this particular one, it's the 3.5 as we talked about earlier. So I backed it all the way out to it stopped, and then 3.5 turns in. So make sure we get that in there just so. Slowly, so we don't splash ourselves and lose fluid. And make sure the spacer is centered inside the spring. All right. And the next step will require the helper again, because we're going to have to do the opposite of what we just did to take it apart. I'm going to have to compress the spring, get that wedge in there, etc. Perfect. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Recall that the maximum amount that you can turn in this adjustment screw is 3.5 turns. So to make sure that I'm right there, what I've done is I've backed it all the way out counterclockwise and then counted exactly 3.5 turns before we put it together. So we'll remove this rod. Put this back in. Slowly, so you can see the oil coming out. You can pretty much just let gravity take it. There we go. And we'll thread that down until it stops. You don't need to get it really tight, just till it stops. All right, there we go. We're going to tighten the jam nut next, but before we do, I'm going to loosen this just a little bit. There we go. Now that we've got all the internals combined, we can go back to the vise and not worry about the inner tube dropping out of the outer tube. So next thing up is to fasten the cap, but before I do, I'm going to take this opportunity to put a little grease around the threads. Make this easier for next time. I can just lift up on the bottom there. There we go. Set that down gently. And then we're going to rotate this the reverse direction to make sure the thread seats properly. And we'll hear it clunk. There it is. That tells you our thread has jumped down because we have the weight pulling down on it. And now we know they're aligned properly and we can get started twisting that together. Do it like there. All right, and how tight does this need to be? Not tight. Just go till it stops. Give it a little bit extra. You're good. The next thing I'll do is go back and adjust the settings. So I've got so much changed on this that my best guess as to where to start is just going to be smack dab in the middle and vary it from there. So I can see I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines there. I'm going to go to 3. I backed this out 1 turn earlier, so what I think I'm going to do, we got 3.5, right? So I'll probably just go 2 turns out. We'll do the same on the bottom side, Just aim for the middle and see how we do. If you've joined me this far, you've done it. We just repeat the exact same process on the other fork and mount them up and you're good to go. If you like this video, please do hit the button, subscribe. I've got lots of videos. I'm putting them out about once a week these days. Whatever I'm doing to the bike, I'm covering. So if you have any other suggestions, let me know in the comments section. I'll get back to you. And liking and subscribing does wonders for me. So please do that as well. So I'm going to mount this to the bike. I'm going to hit a track day in a week, and maybe we'll see each other out there. Till then, ride smart.